Hello, thank you for having me here today. My name is Trish Buben, and I am a professional genealogist and owner of Stonycreek Genealogy. I am based out of Pittsburgh, PA, and focus much of my research in southwestern Pennsylvania. Today, we are going to be talking about the peopling of Western Pennsylvania. I titled this talk, Where Yinz From, because the word Yinz is a common word used in the western part of the state, particularly southwestern Pennsylvania. It has the same meaning of y'all or yous. It is a perfect title for this talk because while Yinz originated from the Scots-Irish immigrants, it has been adopted by subsequent settlers and remains a word synonymous with Western Pennsylvania. Here's our agenda for today. We are going to have a brief history of Pennsylvania and then move into the formation of the state's modern boundaries. From there, we will move on to discussing various groups of people in different parts of the state over about a 100-year period. There will be time for questions at the end too. So let's get started. The colony of Pennsylvania started small. Its area was basically the city of Philadelphia and a little bit surrounding it. Through land purchases from Native American tribes, the state began to grow. This map here is from 1759, and it shows the first 8 counties: Chester, Philadelphia, Bucks, York, Lancaster, Berks, Northampton, and Cumberland. Cumberland here, you can see, is almost the entire western part of the state. It is the mother from which all of the western counties will form. This map is a little hard to read unless you really zoom in, which is hard in a presentation. So I've traced over the county boundaries to just give you a little bit more definition. As the Pennsylvania colony grew, there was a higher and higher need for land. The colonists began to push west to the frontier. This expansion was expensive for England. As the colonies grew, England had to build and staff and support more and more forts to protect the colonists from not only the French and Spanish, but also from the Native Americans. The Native Americans consistently attacked the settlers because the settlers were on land that was not available for settlement. The colonists were stealing land from them. Following the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as it's called here, King George issued the Proclamation of 1763 to try and bring peace. The proclamation established a boundary line between the colonists and the Native Americans. It did not work well. There was already a great deal of land speculation on the western portion of Pennsylvania before the proclamation of 1763. Wealthy land speculators like George Washington were deprived of lands they already owned by this proclamation. Also, settlers who didn't have a legal claim to the land they were on, known as squatters, were already living on the other side of the line. All of this, coupled with internal fighting amongst the Native American tribes of eastern North America, I placed feathers on the map here to denote just a few of the known Native American camps or trails, just to highlight the overlap of settlement for you. And for any Penn State fans out there, the little lion paw is basically where State College is today. But let's get back to the 18th century. So there were battles and skirmishes until 1768, when the Treaty of Fort Stanwix was negotiated. This treaty pushed the western boundary of land available for settlement to the Ohio River. There would be 2 more additional growths to the state of Pennsylvania before it would reach its modern-day boundaries. The first was known as the Last Purchase, and it was made in 1784. It is the light yellow section up here in the northwest corner of the map. The other addition was from the purchase of the Erie Triangle in 1792 from the federal government, shown here in the uppermost left corner in blue. The lands were open and the people came. But before we go into the peopling of the lands, I want to give a little disclaimer. We will not talk about every different immigrant group in every corner of the state throughout its more than 300-year history. There are simply too many to talk about for the little time we have remaining today. Instead, we will focus on a few different groups in specific places at specific times throughout Western Pennsylvania history. Please remember, these regions on a whole were not monoliths. They were a mixture of people. Different groups came at different times in waves of settlement, all eventually coming together to become Pennsylvanians. So let's start our exploration by looking at some of the larger regional industries and themes that existed in Western Pennsylvania in the 1800s. When Pennsylvania was first settled, trees covered approximately 90% of the land. These dense forests were an amazing natural resource for the state. These trees were massive and took a great deal of effort to clear for farming. It took even more effort to build the infrastructure necessary to export the timber outside of Pennsylvania. The northern counties of Pennsylvania, like Warren, Forest, McKean, and Elk, saw waves and waves of immigrants as their timbering industry developed. The forests were so thick, it took until the 1920s for the industry to fully exhaust the available timber. A part of the last land acquisitions we talked about, what would become Allegheny, Beaver, Lawrence, Butler, Mercer, Warren, Armstrong, Venango, Crawford, Forest, and Erie counties, so almost all of this, were designated by the Pennsylvania legislature to be depreciation and donation lands. Depreciation lands were intended to be a form of payment for Revolutionary soldiers, since the continental money they were paid in had depreciated in value. The land was sold off to pay the veterans. The donation lands were set aside to be a form of bonus for soldiers who had fought for Pennsylvania during the Revolution. These lands were often not settled by those who were awarded them because the soldiers often sold the warrants. The process of selling the land and proving the warrants was exceptionally confusing and resulted in years of court cases to figure out who owned what. This greatly slowed development in the region. The Erie Canal opened in 1825, providing a way for goods to travel from the city of New York westward. The state of Pennsylvania was not willing to cede such a valuable transportation route to its neighbor, so it began to invest in expanding its railroad west. Eventually, the railroads would become the engine of Pennsylvania's industries. The rails could not only move people and goods from one part of the state to the other, but they also provided jobs for immigrants. There was a great deal of work done by Irish immigrants and African Americans to clear the land and lay rail. The engines and cars had to be built, driven, and maintained. Wherever the railroad went, industry flourished. The city of Altoona in Blair County became the epicenter for the railroad industry in Pennsylvania with its famous horseshoe curve that opened in 1854. The curve allowed transport over the Allegheny Mountains. Italian immigrants quickly became the dominant group to work in Altoona, Many would spend their entire careers with the railroad. The Erie Triangle was the last purchased land to give Pennsylvania its modern boundaries. This little corner gave the state access to the Great Lakes. During the War of 1812, a naval shipbuilding facility was constructed on Presque Isle, Erie County, to protect Pennsylvania from the British. Oliver Perry's famous flagship, the Niagara, was built in 1813 from wood harvested in the surrounding area. But that's enough broad strokes for now. Let's look at some more specific places. Today, we will be focusing on the 26 counties west of Center County that are typically described as Western Pennsylvania. We are going to spend time talking about settlers from Belgium, Italy, the Great Migration, Germany, Ireland, and the Slavic regions of Europe. So let's get into it. One of the largest groups to come in the initial settlement waves to Western Pennsylvania were the Palatine Germans. They were a group of immigrants from the southern Rhineland area of Germany. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, that region was victim to continual warfare and poor growing conditions. As a result, thousands of Palatines immigrated to England in 1709. Living in what we would equate to a refugee camp, their numbers were overwhelming to the local government and resulted in poor living conditions. Providing new lives for these refugees in the New World was advantageous for the British government. These settlers then traveled to New York and Pennsylvania mostly. The term Palatine German became the term for all German immigrants, even if they came in later waves. In German culture, it was traditional for families to provide land for each of their heirs. As a result, there was a constant need for more land, as the original deeds got smaller and smaller with each passing generation. Their desire for land helped them to keep pushing west. When the lands from the Treaty of Fort Stanwix became open to European settlement, the Palatine Germans eagerly migrated. Through the following generations, they kept their German culture. This is a portion of a will from one of the families I researched. They lived in what is today Jenner Township, Somerset County, but what was then Bedford County when it was originally settled. This will was proved in 1826, and it is noted here that Simon Schaefer signed his name on his will in German. As far as I can research, Simon Schaefer is at least a second generation immigrant, but more likely he is a descendant of the first Palatines and would have been a third generation immigrant and was still signing documents in German. Simon Schaefer was a founding member of the Zion Lutheran Church in Jenner Township. This is a title page of the parish record that is in an archive in Gettysburg. The records are in German for decades before they switched to English by the end of the book. While the Palatines were settling into the eastern side of Bedford County, another group of early immigrants, the Scots-Irish, were settling further west in what would become Westmoreland County. The Scots-Irish were people who initially immigrated from Scotland to the province of Ulster in Ireland, where they lived for multiple generations before coming to America. Largely Presbyterian, the Scots-Irish were a religious minority in Ireland, and along with the Irish Catholics, were disadvantaged by penal laws against non-Anglicans. Anglican Church was the official state church. So, fleeing religious persecution, and looking for better financial opportunities caused many Scots-Irish to settle in Pennsylvania. During the American Revolution, the Scots-Irish were ardent supporters for the Patriots' cause. Many served their adopted nation in the military. Following the war, the fledgling country was deep in debt. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton decided to pay that debt off by taxing the production of whiskey. In the frontier lands of Western Pennsylvania, where roads were few and those that were around were in poor condition, whiskey is how farmers were able to get their wares to market. It was too expensive and difficult to transport raw grain to market, but barrels of whiskey could be strapped to mules and transported over the mountains that way. Everyone distilled their grains. It was the currency of Western Pennsylvania. The excise tax sparked the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s. The Scots-Irish, who had fought for their nation's freedom, were now fighting again against this unjust tax. The rebellion was not quelled until tens of thousands of troops, initially led by President George Washington, marched to the area. After peace was secured, much of Western Pennsylvania turned its focus on becoming Americans and developing this young nation. From its founding, Pennsylvanians have always been looking for ways to improve the land. Initially, that was clearing trees and planting crops. But other industries also soon began to grow. Iron production was one of these early industries. This is a photo of Hopewell Furnace. It's in Berks County. It is from the late 1800s, but I wanted to show it to you so you could have a visualization of what a furnace did look like. The furnace itself is here on this side. Berks County is in the eastern part of the state, and that is where most of the iron production initially was centered, because that's where people lived, and then later on, because that's where the anthracite coal deposits were. Anthracite coal was the fuel for the blast furnaces. However, in the mid-1800s, things began to shift to the western part of the state. The discovery of coke smelting allowed for the use of bituminous coal in iron production. The Great Western Iron Works began operating in Brady's Bend, Armstrong County in 1839. They focused their production initially on products like nails. After being acquired by the Brady's Bend Iron Works in 1844, a rolling mill was added so that the company could make railroad rails. Brady's Bend became the first works west of the Allegheny Mountains to produce T-rails for railroads. This is an example of what a modern T-rail looks like. This design was an improvement on the old technology. Armstrong County was an ideal location for an iron mill, as it had all of the raw ingredients needed for iron production nearby. The Allegheny River gave the area good access to Pittsburgh and other markets. Brady's Bend was an ideal location because specifically the surrounding land was not suitable for agriculture. The people who worked in the iron works were what would have been called old stock Americans, or the descendants of the Scots-Irish and the Palatine Germans we were just talking about. As Pennsylvania industrialized, there were more and more job opportunities for more groups of people. Another industry that developed during this time was limestone production. This is an example of what limestone kilns in nearby Blair County looked like. These are located in modern-day Canoe Creek State Park. and were built by the Blair Limestone Company in the early 1900s. Limestone is an important ingredient in the production of steel. Iron and limestone production was just two of the many industries that developed around Pennsylvania's natural resources. Another of those resources was oil. The presence of oil in northwestern corner of Pennsylvania has been known for centuries. However, it took Edwin L. Drake's discovery of oil in 1859 for the industry to take off. Drake's deliberate drilling for oil was just the beginning of the oil industry in Pennsylvania. Initially worked by Americans from other parts of the country, it did not take long for the work to attract immigrants from around the world. Let's take a closer look at Oil City, Venango County in 1880. Founded just 20 years earlier, Oil City would become the home of Pennzoil, Quaker State, and Wolf's Head Motor Oil companies. In 1880, though, the city was still young and still had a lot of growing to do. One of the families that helped it to grow was that of Michael Silk, a 26-year-old Irish immigrant. In the 1880 census, he is living with his wife, Mary, and their daughter, Nellie. He is working as a conductor for the railroad, which was one of the many businesses supported by the oil industry. Michael Silk immigrated to the United States in 1855 with his parents Patrick and Bridget Silk, as well as siblings Mary and John. While they initially settled in New York, within just a few years, the family was living in Pennsylvania. Michael married his wife, Mary Fitzgerald, in 1866. They would have 4 children together, but none would make it to adulthood. This obituary appeared in the Evening Democrat on October 5th, 1893, for his last surviving child, Mamie. Michael was working in the oil industry in nearby Warren County in 1900, where he would stay for the remainder of his life. Michael died in 1917, a widower living with his sister-in-law. Our next corner to highlight is Washington County. Glassmaking was one of Pennsylvania's largest industries. Not only were the ingredients for glass, like silica and limestone, available in the state, but so was a heat source for the furnaces. First wood was used, then coal, and eventually gas. In 1890, M.J. Alexander, a glass entrepreneur, opened the Charleroi Plate Glass Company, a glass factory in what would become known as Charleroi, Washington County. Named for Charleroi, a famous glass-making city in Belgium, the Washington County Charleroi was soon attracting experienced Belgian glassmakers. Labor unrest in Belgium made Pennsylvania a desirable place to live. Other glass companies like Macbeth Evans Glass would soon call Charleroi home as well. Victor Adams was one of the Belgian immigrants who came to Charleroi and worked in the glass industry. Through decades worth of census records, it looks most likely that Victor arrived right around the time the Charleroi Plate Glass Company opened. The passport application of his second wife, Josephine, says that Victor immigrated on November 12, 1891 from Antwerp. Charleroi does not appear to have been the happiest of places for Victor. By 1910, he is widowed after almost 20 years of marriage. He is living with his son Leon. As a rumor, he is no longer working in the glass industry, but is instead a plumber. In 1913, he remarries to Josephine and is living in Steubenville, Ohio. He will stay there until his death in 1937. Glassmaking will continue in Charleroi for the next 100+ years. The last glass-making factory in Charleroi just closed this year. Underneath most of Western Pennsylvania were vast deposits of coal. In the eastern part of the state, there were anthracite coal deposits. Immigrants from other coal mining cultures like Wales and England immigrated to work them. In the west half of Pennsylvania, there was bituminous coal. First, they were mined by Welsh and English miners, but eventually the need for miners was greater than there were numbers. This is an illustration from a few years earlier that was in Harper's Weekly, and it showed a view of the mines and miners to the American people. In 1897, the Burr-Wind-White Company opened the coal mine Eureka 30 and built the town of Wimber in the northwest corner of Somerset County. Wimber was built as a model coal mining town. It had broad streets and large houses for company higher-ups, as well as a large company store. This is a photograph of it from 1915. Surrounding the town were more than a dozen other coal mines. These mines were like little villages and often referred to as coal patches. As the number of mines grew, so did the miner population. By 1911, 75% of the population of Wimber was foreign-born. A large percentage of those immigrants were collectively Slavic peoples. They came from Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia. One such immigrant was Joseph Skiba. He was born in Poland and immigrated in 1888. He was working as a coal miner, but could not speak English. He was living in Wimber with his son and wife. 8 years after the census was taken, Joseph Skiba died in an accident outside of the mine. He tried to jump on a moving train and was caught between it and a door jamb. He sustained fatal injuries and died. This picture here is a few years later than Joseph's accident, but I wanted you to see what the trains looked like. For bituminous coal mines, there are records of injuries and fatalities from 1883 to 1972. I have information on the index for those records in the handout. In 1908, when Joseph died, 672 people died both inside and outside of mines in Pennsylvania. Burr-Wind-White specifically had 5,367 inside employees that year, meaning they worked inside the mine. They had 14 deaths inside their mines that year. But Joseph Skiba died outside of the mine, so his death is not figured into that statistic. These records highlight not only where and when the accident took place, but also who was involved and if they were married and had children. While Joseph is listed as being married, he leaves behind no orphans. His child, who we saw in the 1900 census, John, has presumably died. I have not been able to find out what happened to Victoria, Joseph's widow, after his death either. Coal mining is dangerous now, and it has always been dangerous. Many families were shaped by their experiences in the mines. The people of Western Pennsylvania, no matter where they came from, have always been shaped by the industry around them, be it from facing the hardships of frontier life to the dangers of various industries. This did not stop them from creating lives, having children, and building community. Let's look at one of those families in Beaver County. Beaver County has been home to several types of industries. Initially, the area was mostly agrarian, particularly as the messiness of the donation land warrants were sorted out. Starting in the mid-1800s, though, glass and pottery production began to grow. In 1905, Jones and Lachlan Steel, or J&L Steel, opened a new factory in Aliquippa, Beaver County. The factory needed an extensive workforce to operate, and immigrants poured into the area. Let's follow one of these workers, Giorgio Candelma. In 1910, he's living with his wife and their children. Through census records and the birth certificates of many of his 12 children, we can see that Giorgio worked in the steel mill for decades before shifting careers to working for Aliquippa Borough. This photo is of the house where Giorgio and Clara raised their family. According to the census records, they lived in this house for more than 40 years. It is rather small by today's standards, only about 1,200 square feet, but there were often 14 people or more living in that house at a time. The family obviously remained close over the decades. Many of their adult children lived with them even as they had married and had families of their own. They chose to continue being together even in death. All but 3 of Giorgio and Clara's children and their children's spouses, and even some of their grandchildren, are all buried at Mount Olivet Catholic Cemetery in Beaver County together. People from other countries were not the only ones moving to Western Pennsylvania. During the early part of the 19th century, there was a great deal of movement of African Americans out of the South as part of the Great Migration. In an attempt to establish a better life than was available in the Jim Crow South, thousands of African Americans followed the train routes north in what would become known as the Great Migration. Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh were common destinations for the travelers. In Pittsburgh and the surrounding areas, there were steel mills, glass plants, coal mines, and other industry hungry for workers. Many African Americans settled in the famed Pittsburgh neighborhood, the Hill District, but others settled in neighborhoods like Manchester. Located in the North Shore of Pittsburgh and what was Allegheny City, Manchester was a popular neighborhood. This census right here is from 1930, right in the middle of the Great Migration, which was from about 1910 to 1970. These people all live on Magnolia Street, which was basically beside the mills situated along the Ohio River near the confluence of the rivers. All of them on this page were born somewhere in the South, all of them. Alabama, South Carolina, Virginia, Mississippi, Georgia, and Tennessee. They came from all over. Let's look a little closer at the highlighted family. Hilliard Brown and his wife, Ruth, and their children. Their last name was actually Bryant, but Hilliard and Ruth were born in Chipley, Georgia. According to the 1930 census info, they moved to Pennsylvania sometime around 1924, as their daughter Maddie was listed as having been born in Georgia in 1923, and their daughter Sarah was listed as having been born in Pennsylvania in 1925. Hilliard was a veteran of World War I, but he only served for a few months before the armistice. He did not qualify for a pension. The paper trail gets murky for Hilliard and Ruth after this, but Ruth died in Pittsburgh in 1944. Her children stayed and built families, and her grandchildren were born and still live in Pittsburgh today. In 1930, African Americans made up about 8% of Pittsburgh's population. 20 years later, that number had grown to about 12%, all while the city's population grew as well, the overall population. So, what did we talk about today? We discussed a little bit of the history of the formation of Pennsylvania and its modern boundaries. We talked specifically about the Treaty of Fort Stanwix and the last purchase. We talked about some of the groups that settled in Pennsylvania over the last 300 years, focusing particularly on the Palatine Germans in the 1780s in Bedford County, the Scots-Irish in 1790 in Westmoreland County, ironworks in Armstrong County in 1840, the Irish in Oil City of Venango County in 1860, the Belgians in Charleroi, Washington County in 1880, the Slavic peoples in Somerset County in 1900, the Italians in Aliquippa, Beaver County in 1910, and the African Americans in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, during the Great Migration in the 1920s. Well, we talked a lot about a lot of different groups and people throughout the western part of the state. We, of course, did not talk about all of them. That is for another presentation. Thank you for your time. Do you have any questions?
We do have a few questions for you. So let's see. The first one is asking about if you've had any luck with trying to track down who might have come to Pennsylvania on the Susquehanna Land Company, and if you could kind of speak to that a little bit.
A little bit. But the Susquehanna Land Company was a little bit further east, so it's outside of the focus of today's presentation. There are record groups between Pennsylvania and Connecticut that do directly address that.
The next question says that they have a great-grandfather whose brother died in a coal mine in Cambria in 1902. They're trying to find his grave and wanted to see if you have any ideas on where to look to see where he might be buried. So, and then
Yeah,
give some information about the
yeah.
mine. It says Eureka, number 35, then
So
Cambria.
Eureka 35 was probably a Wimber mine. I would have to double check. I kind of forget sometimes their numbers, but 1902, that death record should be in the index I mentioned. The index is by last name. So you can site search for the name, it'll tell you the year, and then it'll tell you what publication to look for the actual report. And in the report, it will say where the accident happened. So I would look where the accident happened. Now, the person who I highlighted here, I wasn't able to find his grave. It should be in Wimber, and I couldn't find it. So good luck, but those would be the steps I would take to try and track it down.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mhm.
And the next one, this person says they're looking for a town that seems to have disappeared into history. So they say in the 1840s they came to New Freedom, Blair County, Pennsylvania. Any suggestions on where to look for clues about the town?
So there are a couple places. There is the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, the PHMC. They have published for every county a genealogy of the county. And so what that lists is different townships and different formation names because they're not the same now that they were then. So you can often find them that way. How I always find it is, so it's Blair County. I would search Blair County history PHMC, and that usually pops, and it's like a 2 or 3 page PDF. If that was a coal mine name, which I don't think there was a lot in Blair, but you can also look for the township name because that's how like census records are recorded. Like the record we looked at for Wimber, that's listed as Paint Township. So if you search for Wimber, you wouldn't find it.
Thank you. And then it looks like one more here. So they say their fifth great grandfather came from Germany and settled in Westmoreland County around 1754. They're interested in learning more about the area. And do you have a particular website or suggestions for that research?
So this is kind of a similar thing. Just like the townships changed within the state, so did the counties. So like I said in the beginning of the presentation, like Cumberland was everything, and then it got parsed down smaller and smaller and smaller. So 1754 in Westmoreland County, I would check and see if you know where in Westmoreland County, because Fayette, I think, came from Westmoreland. Like you can search the different those genealogies I mentioned for the PHMC. They will say on there, this county came, like Somerset County came from Bedford County. And so when you know your modern county and you have the full genealogy, then you know where to look for records when. So I'm sorry, I don't remember the year, 1754.
Yes.
So if you're looking for specifically a record in 1754, you want to make sure you're looking in Westmoreland County records. However, if you go forward just a few more years and the county calves and becomes Fayette, then you need to follow that person to Fayette because the records will move as the land changes names.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I think that'll finish this up. So I will stick our email address in the chat. It's genealogy@acpl.info. So if anybody would like a copy of the chat or if you have any questions that pop up afterwards, feel free to send us an email. So thank you everybody for attending, and thank you very much, Trish, for your time and your great
Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.